The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Before we begin, I ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. The purpose of today's hearing is to explore the lessons learned from the catastrophic 2017 wildfire season that led to a record number of deaths and destroyed land and critical infrastructure throughout 10 western states, especially California. First and foremost, our thoughts and prayers are with all those who have been and continue to be impacted by these wildfires, as well as their fellow Americans working to restore vital services to the affected communities. As the subcommittee with primary jurisdiction over the Federal Emergency Management Agency, it is our responsibility to hear from FEMA and state and local emergency managers, including fire departments, who led the response to and are driving the recovery from the fires. Unfortunately, 2017 was marked by many major disasters, and while there has been focus on Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, 2017 also included one of the worst wildfire seasons in United States history. Nationwide, over 66,000 wildfires burned over 9.7 million acres of land. In California alone, some 7,000 wildfires burned through over 500,000 acres of land, an area larger than the size of New York City and Philadelphia combined. The 2017 wildfire season was the most destructive and costliest for California in its history, and the third most destructive season nationwide. It is imperative that we address the destruction caused by the 2017 wildfire season and work to inform long-term policy solutions while highlighting the importance of mitigation and resiliency. On November 30th, 2017, the committee unanimously approved legislation I introduced, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, on a bipartisan basis because of the good work that began here with this subcommittee. This legislation incorporated key provisions included in the Smart Rebuilding Act introduced by Chairman Denham. I want to thank Chairman Denham for his leadership on this issue. The focus of DRRA and the Smart Rebuilding Act is to place emphasis on pre-disaster mitigation to help ensure that our communities are well equipped to withstand disasters of all kinds. There is a clear return on investment from mitigation. For every $1 spent on mitigation, the taxpayer saves $6 to $8. The rebuilding that must be done in the wake of these wildfires provides an important opportunity to encourage smart, resilient rebuilding, increased mitigation measures, and cost-effective federal investments. It is my hope that an examination of last year's wildfire season will help inform how to strengthen our ability to withstand future disasters of all types across the nation. I want to thank you all for being here today. I look forward to hearing from you on this important issue. I would like to welcome our new ranking member of the subcommittee, my friend and colleague, Ms. Titus. I look forward to working closely with you. I now recognize Ranking Member Titus for a brief opening statement.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As you mentioned, this is my first hearing in the new position of ranking member of this subcommittee, and I'm very excited to be part of it and look forward to working with you and the other members. I also like to point out that we have a visitor with us who is a valued colleague, not a member of the committee, but someone whose district is greatly affected by the topic we're going to be discussing, Mr. Salud Carbajal from California's 24th District. He represents Ventura, Santa Barbara, and San Luis Obispo, where they had the largest fire in California, and I'd like to welcome him and appreciate his input. I represent a neighbor of California, Nevada, in fact, the heart of the Las Vegas Valley. And like the other states, Nevada is at risk of many natural disasters. We have earthquakes, wildfires, severe winter storms, and floods. So addressing these matters is very important to my constituency. We don't see it as a Democrat or Republican matter, but as a something that we as a nation need to invest in, make a commitment to, so our communities can be more prepared and resilient. This committee has operated in that bipartisan fashion, and I thank the chairman for that. We need to work together on these issues that impact the health, safety, security, and welfare of all our constituents. Today's hearing on wildfires is extremely timely because we're seeing natural disasters like wildfires happen much more frequently with increasingly costly impacts. So the federal government needs to take wildfires seriously. My home state of Nevada has experienced wildfires so severe that we've called upon FEMA for additional resources through the Fire Management Assistance Grant Program for fire suppression assistance 7 times over the last 2 years alone. These wildfires have caused devastating losses to our communities. They've destroyed landscapes that can lead to flash flooding and mudslides, and that creates even further disasters. For example, the 2013 Carpenter Fire just outside of Las Vegas at Mount Charleston led to severe flash flooding. It destroyed homes, businesses, wildlife habitat, and endangered the lives of residents and first responders. Now, Benjamin Franklin said that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and nothing could be further from the truth when it comes to dealing with wildfires. So we need to invest in mitigation. Unfortunately, I don't think our president has taken this mitigation seriously. If you look at FEMA's pre-disaster mitigation program budget, we see a proposed $39 million, but that's a $61 million cut from the current levels. That's not the way that we should be moving. We should be going in the other direction. The chairman and I agree on this need for mitigation investment. In fact, just last week, we joined nearly 80 of our colleagues urging the Appropriations Committee to support the pre-disaster mitigation program. We just can't continue this ex post facto policy of fire borrowing. Apart from the budgetary issues, I'd like to also hear today about how technology such as unmanned aircraft is playing an increasing role in our detection, monitoring, and response to fires, and how FEMA is working on that. Much of this research is playing out again in Nevada, which is one of the test centers for drone technology. We also have the Nevada Seismology Lab at UNR with their Alert Wildfire program, so I'd be interested in hearing more about what you're doing there. So I look forward to learning more from our witnesses. I welcome them. We know that wildfires don't recognize boundaries, whether it's between states or communities. It should be a federal issue. They cross over invisible lines. If we fail to address these kinds of issues, we will be missing an opportunity here. So thank you all for coming, and I look forward to learning a lot this morning. I yield back.
Thank you. It is now my pleasure to recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. DeFazio, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This obviously is an extremely important topic, particularly as regards fire to those of us who live in the western U.S. My home state had 664,000 acres burned last year, and we spent $454 million on attack and extinguishing and some very preliminary restoration activities. And obviously, I don't think things are going to get better. We're having a very low snowpack this year. And with climate change, which some of us believe in, it's going to get worse. Now, we have a study. And, you know, we do a lot of stuff around here that just doesn't make one iota of sense. So we have the Natural Hazard Mitigation Study, that interim report 2017, we save $6 post-disaster for every dollar of pre-disaster funds that FEMA invests. I'm not going to say spends because these are investments. And yet, the staff of the president, I'm sure he hasn't seen any of this, have proposed to cut that funding to $39 million. Now, they can say, oh, the deficit's $61 million smaller because we cut this wasteful program, except if the disasters happen, and they will, and using that same formula. We just had a paper savings of $61 million, and the actual cost would be over $360 million to the taxpayers of the U.S. Now, the difference is we come up with a phony budget and this omnibus thing being negotiated behind closed doors. Who knows what we'll get for pre-disaster in there. But then when a disaster actually happens, we say, oh, the rules, they don't count. We're just going to borrow the money, and we'll do it afterwards. So you can be fiscally responsible by cutting a program that can save a hell of a lot of money, potentially save lives, save property. But then in the end, you're going to spend more. But it didn't, that doesn't count because we did that off budget with a supplemental emergency appropriation. Boy, is that dumb. We do other dumb things. We require that the Forest Service and the BLM pay for their own firefighting. Every year they exhaust those budgets. Every year they then begin to reduce other outlays for the fiscal year, including fuel reduction, mitigation measures that they would take, leading us to more intense fires in the future. But somehow Congress in its wisdom has decided that floods, tornadoes, earthquakes, windstorms, et cetera, those are all natural disasters that would go via FEMA and ultimately be paid through an emergency supplemental. But nope, not forest fires. Nope, they don't count. No matter how big, no matter how catastrophic, no matter what the loss is. I haven't even seen, and we'll probably hear a number today from the Honorable Gorin about what the total losses are. I mean, many billions of dollars in addition to the lives lost. This is really, we've got to start making a little more sense around here, and hopefully today will help lead us in that direction. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'd like to thank the ranking member. Now, I'm pleased to welcome our panel of witnesses today. I want to thank each of you for being willing to come and testify here. And at this time, I would like to call on Representative Denham to introduce our first witness.
Thank you, Chairman Ferguson, and I also want to thank Chairman Barletta on his continued leadership on these issues. And I want to thank and welcome Mr. Hawley, Deputy Fire Warden and Deputy Director of Emergency Services for Stanislaus County, California, my district. Mr. Hawley brings with him 28 years of experience in fire service, most notably in coordinating the responses to and resources for large wildfire incidents, not only in the Central Valley, but across our entire state. It's the people like Mr. Hawley on the ground that are the backbone of our response capabilities, and the coordination that we have between county and local jurisdictions makes us all much safer as a state. With the devastation that was caused by the 2017 wildfires, it's critical that we ensure our first responders and emergency managers have the support that they need. I know all too well, as serving as chairman of this committee, how critical the issues of disaster preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation are to survival of our communities, and how frustrating I hear from each of you having to cut through red tape at a time of a disaster. That's why I was committed under the wake of Hurricane Sandy back in 2013 to putting together key reforms to help speed up and streamline the recovery costs and reduce the costs as well. And it's those exact reforms we passed in 2013 and made significant changes to the Stafford Act, which actually helped us with the devastation that we saw last year. In November, we also saw an increase in incentives for mitigation. I introduced H.R. 4455, Smart Building Act. We've got to be better prepared as we move forward. As we've seen in Mr. Carbajal's district, not only has his community been devastated by fires, but now certainly facing the challenges of floods and mudslides. We need to make sure that as we're looking across the state and across the country, that we are better prepared with smart building codes and prepared for the different disasters that can hit us across the country. This was included as part of the budget agreement and now signed into law in February. The policy will improve the resilience of homes and businesses from fires and secondary events like floods and mudslides. There's much more we can do. Not only focus on disaster mitigation, but also pre-disaster mitigation. We need to continue to push FEMA to streamline and simplify its disaster assistance programs. You've heard from this committee many times, all disasters are local, which is why it's important for us to focus on a bipartisan level across the entire country on fixing so many of these different issues. Mr. Hawley, I look forward to hearing from your testimony. Thank you for taking the long trip across the country to join us today.
Good. Now, I would like to recognize Mr. Huffman to introduce our next witness, the Honorable Susan Gorin, who is a county supervisor for Sonoma County, California. Mr. Huffman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks also to our ranking member, Mr. DeFazio, our new subcommittee ranking member, Dina Titus, and all the members who are here today for this important conversation, including our colleague, Salud Carbajal from Santa Barbara. This committee has done good bipartisan work, especially the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, and so I'm glad we have a hearing today that will continue us moving forward with this momentum, hopefully seeing that bill through to passage. And toward that end, it's my great honor to introduce to the committee Sonoma County Supervisor Susan Gorin. This committee knows about the wildfires that devastated Northern California last fall. From the Redwood Valley and Potter Valley Complex fires in Mendocino to the Pocket Fire in Geyserville, Tubbs Fire in Santa Rosa, the communities I represent were devastated by these tragedies, and the witness we're going to hear from, Supervisor Gorin, will speak not just to the top-line numbers we're all familiar with, 5,000 homes lost, things like that. Her own home was one of those homes swept through by the fire. And so she's here to tell us 5 months in to this difficult process of rebuilding and recovering how it's going from a firsthand perspective, what it means to a local community, what it means to local government struggling to make ends meet in the wake of a disaster like this. Supervisor Gorin has been living in Sonoma County since 1982. She is very much a product of our local colleges, Santa Rosa Junior College, Sonoma State University, and was elected to the Board of Supervisors in 2012. She's a great colleague of mine, and I'm delighted that she was able to take the red eye and join us on the difficult journey east. Susan, welcome to Washington. Thank you for your testimony today.
Okay, today we're also joined by Mr. Robert Fenton, Jr., the Regional Administrator for Region 4 with the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Mr. Mark Garaducci, Director of the State of California's Office of Emergency Services. Chief Thomas Jenkins, President and Chairman of the Board of the International Association of Fire Chiefs. I ask unanimous consent that our witnesses' full statements be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. For our witnesses, since your written testimony has been made part of the record, the subcommittee would request that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. Administrator Fenton, you may proceed.
I want to start off by thanking Chairman Barletta for having this session today, and thank you, Congressman Ferguson, Ranking Member Titus, and other distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Robert Fenton. I'm the Regional Administrator for FEMA Region 9, located in Oakland, California. It's my pleasure here today to discuss with you FEMA's experience with wildfire operations and discuss how we plan for, mitigate against the growing risk from wildfires. We used to think fire season ran from spring through early fall. However, in recent years, we've seen that's no longer the case. Fire season is now all year long. Taxing the wildfire system, the agencies that make up the nation's emergency management system, and the communities that are threatened by fires. As we saw in recent disasters, wildfires that affect concentrated urban populations such as Santa Rosa, Ventura, California, can stress the emergency management capabilities and cause catastrophic damage. Let me share a few statistics compiled by my colleagues at the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection that highlight the changed fire risks. The years between 2012 and 2015 were the driest period in California's history. In sharp contrast, the following winter of 2016 was one of the wettest periods. The winter fostered excessive vegetation, which grew into kindling, but did not change the overall dry conditions in the forests and watersheds. In 2017, more than 9,000 fires burned approximately 1.2 million acres of land, well ahead of the 5-year average. While 2017 has ended, the impacts of the unprecedented fire season will continue for years to come. The question I'm sure you are asking yourselves is, how can we plan for this type of disaster in the future? The wildfire season has reinforced what we know. Building more resilient communities is the best way to reduce risks to people, property, public budgets, and the economy. I cannot overstate the importance of focusing on investing in mitigation before disaster strikes. Developing capacity before an incident occurs reduces the loss of life and economic disruption. When communities are impacted, we want to see rebuilding that is safer, smarter, and stronger, but there are significant challenges that property owners and communities face in pursuing resilience. For that reason, FEMA Administrator Long is calling for a change in the cycle of opportunity to move mitigation investment to the front of the disaster cycle, not at the end where it typically lies. FEMA is working with federal, state, local, territorial, tribal, and private sector partners to help align pre- and post-disaster mitigation investments to more effectively reduce disaster loss and increase resilience. FEMA manages the Hazard Mitigation Program, the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program, the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grant Program that funds projects such as seismic retrofits, defensible space, safe rooms, and risk reduction for utility and other infrastructure. These funds play a critical role in building resilient communities by reducing the risk of future disaster loss. Effective wildfire mitigation projects include defensible space measures, ignition-resistant construction, and hazardous fuel reduction efforts. From a preparedness perspective, FEMA continues to maintain and strengthen the national preparedness system by helping our non-federal partners build their capabilities, which will reduce their resilience on the federal government in the future. Together, we are working to achieve the national preparedness goal of a secure and resilient nation with the capabilities required across the whole community to prevent, protect against, mitigate, respond to, and recover from the threats of hazards that pose the greatest risk. FEMA is focused on promoting integrated mutual aid across the whole community, continuing the development of the national qualification system for first responders, and advancing a national training and education system and a national exercise program to prepare responders and officials for disasters. While we may never be able to completely eliminate risk, we must do our best to mitigate against it. FEMA continues to work with communities to reach that goal. By far, the 2017 disaster season was one of the busiest for FEMA. However, I would like to acknowledge that FEMA did not do this alone. Disasters pose many challenges at all levels of government. The state of California has done an extraordinary job of building the emergency management capabilities and coordinating local and state level response and recovery efforts. Their leadership and heroism continue to be instrumental in helping survivors. Additionally, we had the support of many federal departments and agencies, including the U.S. Fire Administration, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, U.S. EPA, and the Small Business Administration, among many others from DHS. And I would also be remiss if I did not mention the congressional representatives in California that were personally involved in every phase of the disaster and the critical role they played. Going forward, there are many more opportunities to work together with our partners to identify solutions. I look forward to your questions today. Thank you.
Mr. Fenton, thank you for your testimony. Mr. Garducci, you may proceed.
Hey, good morning, Chairman and members of the committee. Mark Garducci, Director of the Governor's Office of Emergency Services in California. It is really a pleasure to be with you here today and give you some perspective on really the challenges that we have been faced with over the last couple of years. I think to provide some context, clearly to understand that really California coming out of 6 years of extreme drought conditions, and when I mean extreme, these are all record-setting conditions that had impacted the entire state of California. And within that 6 years period, having to deal with some relatively extreme wildfire activity that we saw as sort of precursors to what the potential could be if the conditions of these extreme conditions continued to remain gripped, California gripped throughout the coming years. After the 2015-16 season, where we had drought and severe fires, the conditions changed, and we dealt with a lot of water, a lot of rain at one time that ended up in catastrophic flooding. Throughout the state, we had 52 of the 58 counties under federal disaster declaration. And all of that flooding and that response, I put in context because all of the resources that we have in California were already tasked and taxed in responding to these various events. The floods that we had, of course, presented and prepared for a new crop of flashy fuels that made the conditions much worse. And moving into October then, which was later in the season, at a time when you think that things are starting to cool down and slow down, we started to get red flag, or what we call fire weather conditions, in the northern part of the state, which are typically very, very dangerous and don't happen that often, but when they do, perk everybody's attention. And sure enough, on early in the morning on October the 8th, we had fires break out in 8 different counties. The wind conditions were such that we had up to hurricane force winds, winds exceeding 100 miles an hour, sustained for a long period of time. And in fact, in a 12-hour burning period, when it was all cleared, we had lost over 8,900 homes and businesses in a 12-hour period. This was 8 counties, including the fire that came over through Napa, down into Sonoma, crossed 8 lanes of improved highway into a community that had nothing to do with the WUI or the wildland area, but was in a fire corridor that resulted in the loss of over 1,000 homes just in that one community of Coffey Park. Overall, the Tubbs fire, which is the one that, one of these fires that impacted Sonoma and Napa, really surpassed what our previous large fire was in California that took a great number of homes, and that was the Oakland Hills fire in the 1990s. Throughout this process, our mutual aid system was really stretched, but we do have a tremendous mutual aid capability. While they were dealing with the cascading impacts and really the enormity of the Northern California fires, of all of these homes and these people that had been devastated, the fire weather continued. The extreme weather conditions that we had not seen before continued to take hold of the state and move from a northern posture to a mid part of the state to Southern California. And on December the 10th, we had Southern California, all the counties of Southern California, all the way up to the middle part of the state under red flag conditions. The humidity levels were in single digits. The winds were significant. And sure enough, we started getting fires that broke in Los Angeles and San Diego and in Ventura. The first one being in Ventura, which burned for many, many days and turned out to be the Thomas Fire, now the state's largest fire in its history as far as acreage is concerned. And that fire, beyond burning an additional 1,000 homes in Ventura, went up into the town of Ojai, button hooked around that, and then came down on top of Santa Barbara. The key thing is above Santa Barbara and Ventura is the Los Padres National Forest. So a lot of trees, a lot of watershed that's critical to not only being able to address the capture of rainwater when it rains, but also for the environment and all the other things that go along with that. This fire was so hot and burned so extremely that literally it denuded the entire landscape of that Los Padres National, what we call the Sierra, the front area, and completely wiped out that area. That then set up another dynamic that we had a rainstorm come in, and it resulted in catastrophic floods and mud flows in Santa Barbara, in Montecito, that claimed an additional 22 lives. So 44 lives in the northern fires, 22 lives in the southern fires, and in the southern mud flow. And the requirement of all the resources that were necessary, we had over 10,000 firefighters. We had 400 local engines from our mutual aid program, 200 out-of-state engines, and I can't thank those surrounding states enough. We even brought in 33 firefighters from Victoria, Australia, under an agreement we had. At the highest level, we established a unified coordination group, which really set the overarching priorities for coordination of this, and included FEMA, which, by the way, FEMA, we could not have done this without a great partner, FEMA, and they have been with us lockstep, and I can't say enough about all of their efforts.
Okay. Thank you, sir, for your testimony. It is now my pleasure to recognize Supervisor Gorin. You may proceed.
Thank you so much. Let's see if we're on. There we are. Now we're on. I want to thank the leadership of this committee and the subcommittee for their work that they've previously completed on the disasters that have faced our nation in totality. I grew up in western Pennsylvania, but I've lived in Boston, Colorado, and certainly California. I've been prepared for horrendous snowstorms, nor'easters, tornadoes, hailstorms, and earthquakes, but nothing prepared me for the devastation that I experienced in my district and in my county in October of last year. I want to really thank all of my colleagues on this panel, because without their help every step of the way, we would not have moved forward through recovery and resiliency that we are in the place today. I especially want to thank Congressman Huffman and Congressman Thompson, who have been with us, and the governor was there, and our state senators. It is very important for the local community to see that you and our local elected leaders understand what we are facing, and as you've described in some of your districts, you do indeed understand what we have faced and what you have faced. I want to deviate from my testimony a little bit. Mr. Garladucci really talked about the stress and strains and the magnificent performance of the mutual aid firefighters and first responders throughout the western part of the nation and other states. And it still warms my heart when I see signs in the communities that have been ravaged by the fires to see thank you to the first responders. Without them, we would probably still be here today trying to face an uncertain future. That and the rains. The rains really helped out. And our heart goes out to Santa Barbara. We could have been that community facing the mudslides. We were spared the torrential rains, and our army of volunteers and county organizations placed wattles everywhere around our disaster areas. As you know, that evening, the firestorms overtook Sonoma County with the ferocious winds. It was staggering to me that almost 50 years to that date, the same patterns of fire overtook Sonoma County. And what happened in the Hanley fire 50 years ago took a couple of days to transport themselves across the county line and move into the neighborhoods, took less than 12 hours to totally devastate neighborhoods. I come to you as a supervisor, but also someone, as Congressman Thompson said, lost not one but two homes. The home that I lived in the Fountain Grove area for 20 years, that was lost. Didn't own it now, but the home that I lived in October certainly did lose. I lost it 2 days later, and that is really speaking to the long sustaining nature of the firestorms. It just wasn't that night. It was a week and a half or 2 weeks where homes continued to burn. But CAL FIRE pulled out the maps and knew where the dozer lines were going to go and held the line, and eventually those fires were contained. I want to put a personal slant on it. For those who have never lost a home, you see in the debris, in the ashes, 45 years of life, of marriage, of family history, family photos, the ironing board sticking up in the ashes, and realizing you need to purchase every single item that you lost in the home. It's overwhelming, both from a grief and a time perspective. And you magnify my experience and my husband's experience times 5,000 or more, and you get some scale of the needs of our community. Quickly, I want to really talk about community warning systems. Many of our residents lost their lives. Sadly, we lost 24. But many fled their homes in terror in their bare feet. They were awakened in the middle of the night, losing power, not able to get their cars out of the garage. They lost everything, and they were so fortunate that firefighters picked them up. And I include that the president of Sonoma State University as one of those who fled in the middle of the night. We absolutely need robust, effective, and redundant alert systems that will not fail when the cell towers and the landlines come down. Secondly, disaster preparedness. Often our community members survived because their neighbors knocked on the door or telephoned their friends a couple blocks away. We need to prepare our community, as you just talked about, for the unfolding disasters in the future. I come from a community that is absolutely prepared. In fact, someone knocked on my door to alert me to the evacuation that night. The CERT program and the COPE program are absolutely essential in preparing a community and the population for future disasters. Disaster mitigation, thank you so much for your support in disaster mitigation. We have a number of requests in because we're committed to preventing and arming ourselves with the tools to survive future disasters. They have come before, they will come in the future. And one final note, we desperately need funding, flexible funding for housing. An economist predicted we need 17,000 construction workers to rebuild not only the lost homes, but to build the housing that we needed on the Saturday before the fire. We need money for construction pathway programs and money to build housing to house the construction workers. This is of a scale that we have not contemplated in the past, and we're certainly painfully contemplating now and in the future. Thank you so much for your work, and we appreciate all that you are bringing to this issue.
Thank you, Supervisor, and we appreciate your testimony. Mr. Holly, you may proceed.
Good morning. Thank you again for the invitation. I'm Eric Hawley. I'm the Deputy Fire Warden and the Deputy Director of Emergency Services for Stanislaus County. In addition to my normal day-to-day activities, I'm also our Fire Rescue Operational Area Coordinator, as well as the Emergency Management Mutual Aid, or the EMA Coordinator for Stanislaus County. A little bit about our county. We are in the Central Valley, the southern portion of California's mutual aid system, region number 4. Within Stanislaus County's operational area is the Diablo Mountain Range in the western portion, and the foothills of Sierra Nevada is in the eastern portion of the county. Just over 500,000 people in our county. We do have 21 separate fire agencies that provide some sort of fire protection within our county. Of those agencies, they're fully paid, there are some combination departments, and there's some fully volunteer agencies. Each agency will participate at some level in the California Fire Rescue Mutual Aid System. During the times of emergencies and disasters, I'm responsible for coordinating the local agency responses from Stanislaus County to those incidents. And as part of the California Office of Emergency Services, CalOES Fire Rescue Mutual Aid System, and EMA systems, the past years alone, we've provided fire engines and individuals to wildfires statewide from the border of Mexico all the way up to Oregon, to the state of Washington, the state of Montana, and as recently to Puerto Rico for Hurricane Maria. We send people from firefighters to law enforcement, to emergency medical services, animal services, public works, building department, public health, and county administration departments. This year, Stanislaus County agencies continue to support the Master Mutual Aid System. As in years past, we have found that we've been unable to fill some of our responses, the requests that we've had. We're only able to assist so much before we have drawdown of our own resources to exhaustion levels, and we found ourselves turning down more requests each year for that reason. Some of our agencies have had full-time paid firefighters have had to reduce staffing and close fire stations due to lack of funding. Volunteer agencies have had trouble keeping staffing levels up for years, and with staffing that they do have, it fluctuates on the part of the season. Most of our rural volunteer agencies are in agricultural areas, so during seasons like the harvest season and other specific times of the year, many volunteer firefighters are committed to their farms and ranches and have limited capabilities to respond to calls for service within their own district, let alone being sent out to the large wildfires. Even with these challenges, our counties have been able to put fire equipment on the road in times of need. And when large wildfires start, county operational area coordinators, in using our contiguous counties, we get together and we start pulling our resources to see what we have. And if we only have a few, we marry them up with other resources from other counties. Over the recent years, Stanislaus County operational area, which is our county, includes our fire apparatus and individual personnel have assisted with the operations and management of these large wildland fire incidents. At times, we don't have enough of the equipment or trained personnel in our county to fill those requests. When this occurs, that's when we start reaching out to our neighbors. We're doing all of this as the fires are beginning, as the fire weather starts to come up, and it's kind of at that local level to do that preparedness. We continue to work locally with state and federal agencies on mitigating local hazards through planning, educating the public, training, and exercise for all hazards. Through federal grants funding, we have been able to assist our 9 cities within our county with mitigation planning, the goal of which is to meet those core capabilities of national preparedness. The devastation of the wildfires can cripple a community, leaving it vulnerable to secondary type events such as the landslides that we saw. For our county, weed abatements and fuel reductions is an ongoing task, and each year we spend numerous hours identifying and notifying property owners of hazardous situations. It's time-consuming. We constantly struggle to keep up with the requests from the public regarding fire hazards. With all the responsibilities that our fire agencies have, they just don't have the staffing to do it on a proactive stance. Publication has some of the same areas of concern. Staffing challenges and funding for the education programs continue to be a concern. When agencies have staffing issues for emergency response, the public education and the mitigation suffers. It's important to remember that we need to invest our money and our resources, as you said, up front. Investment in creating emergency plans, mitigation programs, and public education will save lives and property, the environment. Increasing staffing or pre-positioning of fire equipment during red flag warnings or other high probability events likely lessen the likelihood of incidents growing into major incidents. Our operational area did not have a major wildland fire in 2017. Very well could have. We will. We are like many other counties, and we feel lucky that we were not affected this last year. But we continue to try to be prepared as best as we can for these incidents. Most agencies in our county have received at some point or another some funding through staffing of adequate firefighters or the AFG grants, the Assistance Firefighter grants. These have helped with communications and equipment for interoperability, which have allowed our agencies to actually respond outside of our county. We must continue to emphasize the education, the training to strengthen our ability to respond safely and effectively locally and statewide to wildland fire events. Without the properly well-maintained equipment, we would be unable to assist. And there are many pieces of the puzzle. Without them, our state response would be hampered. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Holly. Chief Jenkins, you may proceed.
Good morning, Acting Chairman Ferguson, certainly Chairman Barletta, Ranking Member Titus, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Tom Jenkins, Fire Chief for the City of Rogers, Arkansas. I also serve as the President and Chairman of the Board for the International Association of Fire Chiefs. The International Association of Fire Chiefs represents the leadership of America's fire and emergency medical services agencies. We appreciate the opportunity to testify today about the impact of the 2017 wildfires that affected our great country. Local fire departments, many of whom you may realize were volunteer fire departments, provided nearly 80% of the initial attack on those fires. The IAFC is concerned about the escalating cost and damage caused by these wildfires. According to the National Interagency Wildfire Center, there were approximately 71,500 wildland fires reported last year. They burned, as we heard earlier, nearly 10 million acres. This was an increase of more than 80% over the amount of acreage burned in 2016. In addition, 2017 was a record year in which the federal government spent $2.9 billion on wildland fire suppression. This amount was approximately 84% more than the $1.6 billion spent in 2008. Our nation cannot continue to absorb these growing costs. We agree with the committee's interest in reducing the cost of natural disaster. The International Association of Fire Chiefs supported the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, H.R. 4460, which incentivized states and localities to take steps to mitigate the risk of disaster. For wildland fires, the IAFC supports the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy. Our association is especially focused on promoting community preparedness, improved response capability, and of course, mitigation. The IAFC encourages localities to develop community wildfire protection plans. These plans identify and then mitigate wildland fire risks. They also can guide federal hazardous fuels reduction projects and prioritize the use of federal funding. The IAFC's own Ready, Set, Go program is designed to promote community preparedness. It's a partnership with the USDA Forest Service. Ready, Set, Go helps communities develop mitigation plans, the ready part, teach them to be situationally aware, the set, and then act early following personal wildland fire action plans, or the go. As partners with other community organizations, Ready, Set, Go fire departments and fire districts engage in activities including webcasts, fuel reduction, youth outreach, civic events, home assessments, and door-to-door smoke alarm campaigns. Currently, there are 1,803 Ready, Set, Go members in all 50 states. An effective response is key to controlling the cost of wildfire. The IAFC believes that there is a need for well-vetted qualifications based on the National Wildland Coordinating Group Standard 310-1 for response staffing and resources. However, we also support efforts to recognize prior learning and structural firefighting skills for wildland firefighting duties. Our association is also leading efforts to improve mutual aid agreements in the response to wildland fires. Fire departments depend on assistance from neighbors and oftentimes other states to assist during major fires. The National Mutual Aid System was designed by the IAFC, Intermedics, and ESRI to help departments visualize in real time where resources are and improve decision-making when deploying them. Delayed reimbursements of fire departments is an obstacle to effective fire response. The reimbursement process can take months or even years. Until reimbursement, a local fire department must do without. This delayed reimbursement cycle can reduce a fire department's ability to participate in future mutual aid requests. The IAFC also asked Congress to continue to support mitigation activities. We asked Congress to make permanent recently passed legislation that allows states that receive fire mitigation assistance grants in 2017 and 18 fiscal years to receive hazard mitigation assistance. This assistance will help communities reduce the risk of flooding and landslides that we saw in California in January. The growth of wildland fire across this nation is a clear and present danger to our citizens. America's fire chiefs look forward to working with the committee to promote community preparedness, ensure effective responses to these wildfires, and support mitigation efforts to reduce the risk of fires and ensuing floods and landslides. I look forward to answering any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Jenkins, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say to both you and to Mr. Holly, thank you for your service as first responders and to the men and women that you serve with. And to Supervisor Gorin, I understand I was a mayor prior to deciding I was tired of being happy and running for Congress. But in all seriousness, it is so remarkable to me the partnerships that you have to have with your local with your other stakeholders in there, and I know that the coordination that goes into it, it requires an awful lot of time and commitment. So thank you for doing that at the local level, and let me echo some of the words of my colleagues here. I'm so sorry for the loss of your homes in those devastating fires. In 2017, as you know, we saw many communities and regions and entire states that were truly shattered by these natural disasters, and certainly what's happened out in California has just been absolutely devastating. And so I think it's very important that we examine what has happened, learn from that, and then allow this body to help guide the conversation forward to make sure that local communities and states have the resources that they need, not only to deal with the aftermath, but in my opinion, more importantly, deal with what happens before. I'd also want to take a minute to thank Chairman Barletta for continuing to champion this critical issue. It is something that has been very important to him, and I think we want to recognize his leadership here. With that, I'm going to reserve my questions for the end, and I am now going to recognize the ranking member, Ms. Titus.
Well, thank you very much. If I could ask you, Mr. Fenton, I'd like to follow up on some things that Ranking Member DeFazio mentioned in his opening statement. Last week, when FEMA issued its 2018 to 2022 strategic plan, there was no mention of climate change. It just failed to mention it altogether. And it also removed references to climate change that had been included in the previous 2014 to 2018 strategic plan. I wonder if the administration believes that climate change is real, and how you think we can prepare for natural disasters if we don't acknowledge that it's a significant factor in the cause of those disasters.
Yeah, I represent Region 90, can't speak for either what Brock Long's beliefs are or this administration's beliefs. However, I think in my opening testimony, I testified to the part, to the extent of how fire season in California has changed over the years, and it's significantly changed, including not only the driest years on record, as Mark had talked about, Gil Ducci, the state director, but also the wettest season. So we're seeing changes in the climate in California that have caused a significant fire season, which continues, a prolonged one, which is not only seasonal anymore, but goes year-round. So we are seeing changes that are impacting California with regard to impacts from the environment, plus building into urban areas where it increases the threat and risk of homes in those areas.
Do you think you're going to be able to do your job, or FEMA overall will be able to, with the proposed about $70 million cut in the budget?
Well, I understand that in building a budget, there have to be priorities in building a budget, and you know, the administration's made its decision on those priorities and where to take those cuts. Sufficient right now, I have the resources that I need in order to do my job as a regional administrator, both with the disaster relief fund and funding I have annually to ensure that we're trained and exercised and ready to respond to disasters. One of the areas that I think we need to focus on is how to move more of the pre-disaster mitigation up front, so that we could take action prior to disasters and not take action after disasters to better protect and build resiliency into the communities and infrastructure.
Well, that kind of leads me to my second question. What I mentioned in the opening statement was some interest in the use of unmanned aerial systems. I wonder if you could comment on any barriers that exist with FEMA's budget, or making the acquisition or use of those eligible for grant money, anything we can do to facilitate that, and then maybe some of our first responders could comment if that would be helpful or not.
Yeah, I'm not aware of barriers. I could get back in, with regard to you in writing to the specific grants and what's available and what could be purchased. But I would say that we heavily use unmanned aerial vehicles during these fires to provide information not only during the fires, but access resources through Department of Defense, National Guard, to do things that we've never done before. One of the things that we did is we used National Guard platforms to do assessments of the fires so we can make decisions on the declaration. Plus, the firefighters used it to establish perimeters and make decisions on where to fight the fire and build defenses at. Additionally to that, we're using it right now to remap, using LIDAR systems to remap watersheds that were impacted from these fires and better prepare for the post-event floods that have happened down in the Southern California area, and are preparing this weekend for, or this week, for the events that may happen due to the rain that's oncoming this week.
Gentlemen?
Just speaking to the local level, we do have a few agencies within our county that have some UAWs. Those agencies are the paid agencies in our county. They're strictly using them now for reconnaissance on hazardous material spills, as well as some of the areas that are not really wildland, where we wouldn't have aircraft working, but in large fields or in river bottom areas. They're very much at the very beginnings of the beginning stages of it, but they're starting to use them, and they are showing some good usage with them.
That's an excellent question. Our association has championed the issue that we recognize that while conventional methods to suppress fires work, that the use of technology to try to gain information, whether that's reconnaissance, but information gathering at incident command post is only going to aid whether we're making decisions about evacuation or offensive strategy. And so we are believers in technology, specifically unmanned aerial devices, and we continue to encourage their use as appropriate by local fire departments and jurisdictions.
I'd like for us to be sure that there aren't any barriers in any of the grant programs that keep you from using those to acquire some of this technology, so maybe we can check into that. Just one other question. It's always been a concern to me about the animals in in wildfires, and people often will not leave their pets, or then what do they do with their pets? I had the Animal Emergency Planning Act to try to get FEMA involved in that. I wonder if you would talk about, Mr. Fenton, what FEMA does to encourage local communities to plan for animal evacuation or care, or how to encourage people what to do with their pets. Because if they stay behind for the pets, not only are you going to lose the pets, you may lose the people as well.
Yeah, so following Hurricane Katrina, FEMA has done a lot of work to not only build in caring of pets and evacuation of pets into the national response framework, but more importantly, have worked with state and local governments to ensure that we plan for and build the capacity to be able to care for and evacuate pets during a disaster. California has done a remarkable job on it. I'm sure that Director Gilligiucci can talk to some of the things they did in this disaster, from not only where we both went and saw firsthand where firefighters came to protect pets down in Southern California at a zoo facility, to opening up some of their local fairgrounds to receive pets during fires so that they could go ahead and care for them, and having that process set up beforehand so that people can move them to those locations where they'd be safe is important to have those plans prior to the events, and California's done a tremendous job in having those systems ready.
I'd like to see all the states encouraged to do that as well as California.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Next, I'll recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Denham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hawley, you talked in your opening statement about the operational area and coordinated responses between multiple counties and strike teams. Can you describe from a county level the internal decision-making process you go through on whether or not you're going to put equipment and teams into a different area of the state and the coordination that goes along with that?
Certainly. At the local level, or at the operational or county level, when we hear of fires starting throughout the state, we start to coordinate within our county by making phone calls to those local fire chiefs to see their availability. A lot of it has to do with personnel, with their equipment, if it's ready to go, and then the length of time that it's expected for that equipment to be gone. As we do that, we're also in contact with our contiguous counties and talking with them to see what their availability is, so that as the orders come in for strike teams or task forces to go out to these fires, we can piecemeal things together if we don't have enough resources. We have to look at our county. We have to look at any large incidents that might be occurring, any predicted events that may be coming up, or the weather that's in our county as well, protecting what we have before we can send out more to other wildland areas.
Thank you. And we talk a lot in this committee about being prepared and resiliency. We passed the SMART Act here recently, which will incentivize important building standards as we move forward, but one of those issues is certainly the fuel that goes with the fire. That's a lot of the vegetation, a lot of the growth. I wonder if you could describe what you think could better encourage important activities on taking away some of that fuel.
So our county, on both sides, we have some of the state responsibility area, which is, we have just fire districts that partner with CAL FIRE. They have a very robust system and a program for mitigation of the fuels. A lot of that has to do with annually going in and taking down some of the new growth that comes up where you can have some high fire-prone areas. In the center portion of our county is where most of our rural agricultural areas are. We do have some issues with weed abatement throughout the year and the staffing of those volunteer agencies and getting people out to actually make contact with those agencies. It's a struggle every year, and we seem that with the building codes that we've had and the new resolutions in California for the defensible space, it's helped, but there still needs to be more done with the public education portion of it, I believe.
Thank you. And Mr. Ghettaducci, I've appreciated the opportunity to work with you on some of these disasters and the quick response that we've seen from the governor's team. One of the big questions that continues to come up is we're trying to rebuild major infrastructure, especially in the north part of the state, where we've had a number of conversations about how do you get trucks in and out, debris in and out, how do you fix the bridges in a very, very quick fashion. We passed the NEPA Reciprocity Act, which is not only allows us for quick environmental review, but allows us to streamline the process. Now California has the opportunity to apply for Section 1309 under the FAST Act. Question is, will your department and the governor take advantage of that and move to quickly expedite those projects?
So that's a good question. Thank you, Congressman. I think that the 1309 is an area that we are looking at, and we will leverage and maximize it to the advantage of the community. The debris operation in the case of the North Bay fires really was an unprecedented event. To date, we've moved over 1.6 million tons of debris. In context, that's 2 Golden Gate bridges, if you can get a sense of how much debris that is. And we've done that all in a period of about 5 months, which is an unprecedented work pace, in addition to the work that we're doing in Southern California. And the idea is to be able to get those communities as clean and clear as possible so that the rebuilding can start. But not just rebuilding starting in those areas, to have a very serious policy discussion.
Let me just, I've only got a little bit of time left. Let me be succinct about this. NEPA Reciprocity Act right now has a 2-year review process. We'd like to shrink that down to 180 days. We'd like to see if the governor is going to be supportive of that, especially, we see the governor is supportive of waiving CEQA for football fields, and we saw Pac Bell Park by a previous governor. We waive CEQA all the time. I would think it would be very important to streamline NEPA CEQA in the case of communities that have been devastated. We want to rebuild real quick. Yeah. So it should be a very simple answer, and I would hope the governor would work with us on changing that.
We are looking at that.
Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you. Now recognize Mr. Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as I look at this panel, I see this great team of firefighters, local government, Cal OES, and FEMA. And this is part of the story that I think we can celebrate as a success, despite the tragedy that visited our communities. I saw many of these folks every single day during the worst of the wildfires. They worked together seamlessly. The resources that were mobilized from around the western United States with firefighters streaming in, prison crews from neighboring states were impressive. There's a lot about this system that actually does work, and we are grateful for that, and we learned it firsthand. But a lot of when we talk about how we can do better going forward, we do need to continue this focus on pre-disaster strategies. And so I want to ask our witnesses about that. And Supervisor Gorin, you did touch on the emergency alert system and warnings. We saw a lot of folks who lost their lives, unfortunately, in our region, and many of those were vulnerable populations, many elderly who didn't get word, or even in some cases were trying to get out but couldn't, the power was out, they couldn't open their garage doors, and we saw folks who lost their lives in their cars, in their garages. I'd like to hear your thoughts on pre-disaster planning and strategies that can help us with the evacuation of vulnerable populations. And then also on the telecommunications piece of this, we've seen after these disasters, you know, we can set up wireless hotspots, mobile cell sites, charging stations, all these things that help. But what can we do to have a more robust system proactively in advance of these things?
This is a very astute question, because that is exactly what led to the number of houses lost and the number of lives lost. We are looking at redundant and robust alert systems in the future, using perhaps the Lake Tahoe system, very tall poles with cameras on it. We could have seen the arcing of the wires and the flash of the fires in Napa County when they first started, and we could have brought in air resources to suppress those fires at the very beginning. And this is what many counties were able to accomplish. But the erratic winds that we experienced drove those fires so fast and so furiously. Quite frankly, the cloud cover was so thick that we couldn't get in, hopefully I'm describing this correctly, we couldn't get in the air support to suppress the fires. So we absolutely need the LIDAR and the smoke penetrating devices to know where the fires are and how to suppress them. But the alert system, we know of many people who lost their lives because they were hearing impaired. They took out their hearing aids during the night of the fire. A neighbor knocked on their door, but they didn't respond. And so we not only need to acknowledge the rapid acknowledgement of a fire and bringing the resources to suppress that initially, and in many different locations, because we had many fires breaking out in Sonoma County all on the night of the firestorm, and then merging into two enormous fires as they went through the county over the next 2 weeks. We need to make sure that those alert systems, and thank you for your work on the alert systems and the wireless alert systems. Some of the firefighters were so frustrated. We lost cell towers, landlines. They were ready to throw their cell phones in the fires because they could not communicate. So we need to make sure that our vulnerable populations also have the benefit of those alert systems. And just one other factoid, the Sonoma County assessor has determined that thus far 5,100 homes were damaged or destroyed in the fire in Sonoma County, a total loss of $1.6 billion of assessed value. I'm missing a very important budget meeting today. We're grappling with a budget deficit in the tens of millions of dollars for the next couple of years because of our expenses and unreimbursed expenses. So anything that you can do to help not only the cities, the counties, you're absolutely right, we are working together, but all of the special districts put together, including the fire districts. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor. I'm just about out of time, but I wanted to give Administrator Fenton a chance to agree with me, if he does, that the Emergency Management Performance Grant Program is a great way for FEMA to support communities like Sonoma County that are working on strategies to quickly evacuate vulnerable populations.
Yes, I definitely agree. Also, I think moving more funds up front, as I talked about earlier, will help us even before disasters to build in resiliency to communities, and specifically on the IPI system and being able to do alert and warnings and communication infrastructure, all which is critical to provide people timely information to evacuate when necessary. All those things and resources could be resolved by better planning, building better redundancy, and hardening infrastructure prior to events.
Great. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to recognize Ms. Brownlee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and appreciate you allowing me to be here for this committee hearing. The first thing that I want to say is just a heartfelt, deep appreciation and gratitude to the first responders and firefighters who came to Ventura County as we were fighting this raging fire. It was really unbelievable to see it and to be there. And I just can't tell you on behalf of all the residents of my community, they are so very, very grateful. And everyone that I speak to, even those who lost their homes, their response is always, but we're lucky. We're alive. My neighbors are alive. And certainly in the city of Ventura, where a lot of the damage occurred, people have lived in that community for 20 and 30 years. And so they weren't only concerned about themselves, they were concerned about all of their neighbors as well. So I just can't overemphasize the deep gratitude my community has for all of the first responders. And I will just say that we had, at the height of the firefighting operation, we had 8,500 firefighters there from across the nation, 987 engines, 27 helicopters, 58 water tenders, 153 hand crews, 80 dozers, and firefighters came from Oregon, Arizona, Washington, Idaho, Montana, New Mexico, Nevada, Colorado, and Utah. And I think the thing that impressed me the most was the fact that I know there's a system in place for firefighters nationwide. When a disaster occurs, everyone rallies. But the fact that at the end of the day, this is really truly a volunteer operation, and the fact that everyone came to our calling was just amazing, and it has really impressed upon my community in the county just how grateful they are and how deep their appreciation truly is. And I also want to thank FEMA and Cal OES, because you were there immediately and took charge, and your swift response was just overwhelming. And again, as we are recovering from the disaster, the community is overwhelmingly grateful to you and understands your response to the community, how quickly we have been able to clean up the debris. Obviously, there's a long road ahead in terms of recovery, but we're extraordinarily grateful. And I think, Ms. Gorin, your description in your own community in Sonoma is exactly the same description that I can say in both Ventura County and Santa Barbara County. So thank you for that. We had a fundraising event a couple of weeks ago here in Washington for the Thomas Fire. And the Friday before that, we had 70-mile-hour winds here in Washington, D.C. And I was able to say to all of those, because everyone that was there was from Washington, D.C., or the surrounding area, and I said, imagine severe drought conditions and striking a match with 70-mile-hour winds, and that's exactly what happened in the Thomas fires in Ventura County. And I tell you, the whole room just sort of gasped. So thank you. I wanted to ask Mr. Ghilarducci, so in terms of, do you have an idea, an update on the status of California's reimbursement requests to FEMA for the firefighting, and an estimate of what you think the future costs will be?
Yeah, good question. We do have, well, the update on the firefighting cost and what we call the emergency protective measures has been being processed, and many of those fire agencies have already been reimbursed. I'm happy to say that FEMA has, agreed to provide 100% of reimbursement for firefighting costs, or those costs for protective measures. And it's a varying level on different kinds of projects that we're working on. I was also excited to note, and much of the work of this body being able to successfully get the 90% for debris clearance, and that was a huge benefit to the communities, and we appreciate FEMA's engagement with all that.
Well, thank you for that. And I, too, wanted to just underscore in terms of my opinion, how important pre-disaster and post-disaster mitigation truly is. And when Governor Brown came to Ventura to oversee the disaster that had occurred there, when he spoke, he said, unfortunately, these fires are the new normal for California. And so I concur with that statement, and I think it is critically important that we invest more of our resources in that pre-disaster mitigation, but also the post-disaster, because today we're expecting heavy rains again in Ventura County and are evacuating people as we speak. And so that needs to be addressed. I see that my time is out, but I thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Next, Ms. Plaskett, you're recognized.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member. First, of course, like so many of my colleagues, I want to extend my thanks to you for the work that you do, not just in this last horrendous wildfire that we dealt with, but all throughout the year and all the time. You all are prepared and ready to serve the people of this country, and for that, we're most grateful that you extend not just yourselves, but your families and your lives to support us and to help us, and we're all really grateful for that. You know, I think this is very interesting because the other committee that I'm on is the House Agriculture Committee, which has purview over the U.S. Forest Service. In October, we reported out a bill that was subsequently adopted by the House in November, the Resilience Federal Forest Acts. You're probably familiar with it. Mr. Fenton, one of the things this bill would do is to change the way wildfire fighting efforts are funded, ending a process called the borrowing by allowing now federal agencies to tap into disaster funds from FEMA when wildfire suppression budgets have been exhausted. I understand that one of the concerns with this approach, and I'm wondering if you share this concern, is that since funding requests for the Disaster Relief Fund are based on 10-year average of costs, fires could, don't kill me for the pun, burn through the fund right away, and there may not be enough left for other disasters, such as tsunamis or earthquakes or hurricanes that have occurred most recently. In your view, would the way this approach work fix the issue that had been in the past? And do you share concerns that this would end up being less money for other disasters? And how would you fix this?
Well, so let me start with right now, underneath the Stafford Act, we pay firefighting costs for all fires on state and local land. Mm-hmm. And so all the costs for the Northern California fires and a good portion of the cost for the Southern California fires that were on state and local land, including all the firefighting resources, regardless of local, state, or federal, that fought those fires on those lands, we're reimbursing those costs right now. So what you're talking about specifically fires on federal lands and to fight those fires on federal lands. The Stafford Act was focused on helping state and local governments during events, so it would be a change from that. And to further complicate it, as you pointed out, underneath the Budget Control Act, based on the 10-year history and the amount of funding that it would take to fight those fires on federal lands, it wouldn't leave sufficient funding, and we'd probably be coming and asking for supplementals every month, especially as we got later into the fiscal year. So we need to look for a way to do that outside of tapping into the Stafford Act. I think the Stafford Act has been pretty clearly up till now focused on supporting state and local governments, and I think that should be the continued priority, and we should look at something outside of the Stafford Act to support the Forest Service and their requirements.
But now you haven't said whether or not you agree with being able to tap into the FEMA funding in other areas is going to be beneficial for fighting fires, or from if you're putting on your hat from, you know, when you were directing FEMA, is this a concern that you would have with knowing that there may be, we're taking care of firefighters from our supplemental right now, but that means we're going to have to tap into other funds elsewhere? And not knowing if Congress is going to be willing to give you those supplements into the amount that you need.
Right. So I'm not sure I fully understand your question, but I think it's if we tap into the Stafford Act specific funds that's underneath the 10-year average, it's kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Right.
Therefore, we have to look for another way, and we'd be happy to sit down and have a discussion. And I know Administrator Brock Long has done that and would be happy to entertain those discussions of looking for other ways to meet those requirements on federal lands.
Have you talked about lifting the cap on the amount of funding that would be there?
Well, my understanding is the cap is from sequestration, and it's a cap imposed.
You're not supposed to say the word sequestration around here.
I'm sorry. So it's a learn something every day. It's a so the cap, as I understand it, is an imposed cap.
Right.
Let me change my word here.
It's just a dirty word, isn't it?
It's an imposed cap that would take a change in order for that to be lifted. So it's something that we couldn't internally do on our own.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
Okay, thank you. And seeing that we've got, do you have any more? Mr. Garamendi has gone. Okay. As said before, I reserved my time to ask a few questions here at the end. And I'm going to kind of focus at the local level with these. First, Chief Jenkins, since you kind of view things from a national level, and looking at, we've heard about the disasters in California today, but certainly wildfires occur in other areas of the country as well. Give me a little bit of an idea about if you were going to design a program for mitigation, pre-fire mitigation, what would be the flexibility that you would need to be able to address, say, the concerns in California and the concerns in Georgia or Western Pennsylvania, or even in Arkansas? What are the things that you think local communities and local fire districts would need?
Well, I think the most important attribute of any effort to make our communities not only more responsive to impending, disasters, specifically wildfire, but also more resilient, is that we have to be able to provide them enough framework to make it function. And at the same time, we have to understand that at the local level there are we have to be able to provide some artistic freedom for the uniqueness of the topography and sometimes the vulnerability of those populations at a local level. And so I think it becomes if we were to do something like that, we have to be able to harness an opportunity to work collaboratively with national best practices and also input from local fire and emergency management leadership.
Okay. Mr. Hawley, I was interested in the conversation about removing fuel from the surrounding areas. In Georgia, we do a lot of controlled burns. Every 3 years, you go through and manage the forest that way, make sure that they are harvested correctly. Is that something that's done, and this is from my own knowledge, is that something that was done in this area, or is that not something that you can do because of the topography? Give me an idea of what that's like.
Yeah, I can't speak to the federal and to the state lands. They do controlled burns in their areas. My particular county is in the valley. We have a lot of air control issues, air quality control issues. And with that, it's very specific times of year that we can or cannot do some controlled burns on the agricultural side. But in some of the areas that are more fire prone, it's difficult just because of the topography of our area.
And so you have to go in and manually clear that? Is it when you say that you remove debris?
Correct. We in the areas that butt up against cities and towns, we have the property owners are responsible for clearing that. Sometimes it's difficult to find those property owners. They're from out of the area, or there's been issues where somebody has passed away and we don't know who the rightful property owner is. And trying to find someone to clean that, or we can go in and force clean that, but then that becomes the cost is borne by the district itself, and that can be very expensive, especially for smaller districts.
Okay. If Supervisor Gorin, you talked about the need, lessons learned. You've kind of seen what's happened, and wishing that you had as you said, the taller poles and the cameras that are looking out. And I'll from your perspective at the local level, what, if knowing what you know now, besides the technology, what would you have done from the physical standpoint of protecting the community? What do you think would have been advantageous? And looking, knowing what you know now, looking at other communities, what do you think that should look like?
I really appreciate your astute questions, especially regarding how a community can prepare themselves. And vegetation management is something that we are really focusing on. We love our trees, especially me, but those eucalyptus trees that bordered my property are gone. I did work with a mountain community and a volunteer fire company on vegetation management using a chipper program and our youth ecology corps that we hire, at-risk youth, to work with property owners to cut down the excess fuel, bring the chippers along on the roads, chip it up. The fire agencies are not exactly thrilled with chipping because wood chips do burn, but I checked back with the board president of Maya Kamas. She said we lost 1 out of 3 homes. If we had not engaged in this active vegetation management, we would have lost maybe all or most of those homes. So they are grateful for that kind of program. Also,
I'm about to run out of time, and if I could, because I've got one other question.
Good.
Physical fire breaks and fire roads, is that something that is normal practice, and do you maintain those fire breaks? Okay. Because it's and again, in me trying to understand just the severity of what these communities went through. It sounds like you're doing a lot of the right things. You're managing the fire breaks. You're removing the vegetation. You're doing those kind of things. Was this just such a unique event with the 60 to 70 mile an hour winds? Because it seems like some of the mitigation things were done, correctly, and you're being active in doing that. I make that observation that I want everybody to know that y'all have been doing some of the pre-event mitigation work, and yet this was such an unusual set of circumstances with the drought and the high winds that it was just something that quite candidly was greater than something that we could have prepared for in many ways. Yes.
You're absolutely correct. The challenge that we face, though, is that these unique events are becoming more regular events, and that's the delta that we're facing as public safety and the fire service, and how do we address that? And part of that is, how does local land use planning done now, where you have the wildland urban interface and intermix, and how best can we look at pre-existing fire conditions through situational mapping and forecasting to be able to better identify where those hazard mitigation efforts could take place.
Okay. Well, thank you. And I want to thank each of you for your testimony. I want to thank you for taking time to come across the nation and share with us your perspective, your expertise, and your knowledge. So if there are no further questions, I would ask unanimous consent for the record that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments, information to be submitted by members or witnesses included in the record of today's hearings, and by unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. Without objection, is so ordered. Again, I'd like to thank each of you for your testimony and your time today. If no other members have anything to add, the subcommittee will stand adjourned. Thank you. Thank you.